the diagrams, right, the figures and the tables. So it helps, to basically consolidate what they had discussed um, in the articles. Okay, let's break to 1:45, and then we'll come back and look at NGOs, how they influence foreign policy of states. So um, that's quite a lot, yeah, quite extensive. And of course, no surprise, right? US is the host to the most international NGOs in the world, right? So many international NGOs are actually based in the US, yeah. And US is also one of the largest donors in terms of foreign aid among developed countries. So back in 2008, he had donated $24.42 billion in aid, and that is about 24% of the total amount of official development assistance provided by the development assistance countries, which also encompass Japan, yeah, and I think UK and all. Okay, so yeah, so what are some reasons why states are motivated to provide foreign aid? Some of it is basically because of colonial ties. So if you, for example, if you see France and the its former colonies in Africa, you find that France actually provides quite a bit of foreign aid to its former colonies. Yeah. Sometimes it could be due to strategic hegemony. So, in terms of U.S., they noted that actually there's been, U.S. actually increased its foreign aid to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan during the war on terror. It could also be due to humanitarian or idealistic factors like human rights. So, a lot of these foreign aid countries, donors, right, they are mostly Western liberal democracies. So they sometimes they provide aid to advance human rights. Yeah. And this is usually based on the political and economic needs of the recipient countries. And post Cold War, as you can tell, post Cold War, right, with the U.S. being more or less, I mean, moving more to a unipolar world, right? It's with Soviet Union gone. Um, there was also um, a conscious effort, right, to promote democracy around the world. So that's also part of the reason why you find that U.S. probably was actually putting out a lot of aid, for humanitarian purposes. And then you find that in terms of which countries actually tend to have to receive more aid, you find that um, those recipient countries that are covered more frequently in the media, right, are more likely to receive more aid. So if you think about the CNN effect, this could be um, one of the reasons why, yeah, that if you want to tag it right to a theory, right, the CNN effect would be one possible theory or framework that you can use to explain why they are getting more aid if they're covered more frequently in the media. Yeah. Of course, you will find that I think later on, um, we also talk about humanitarian aid in terms of, the role of media. right, in the use of economic sanctions. But that's on economic sanctions part. This is actually on foreign aid. Okay, so what role do NGOs play? They are, like we mentioned earlier, right, that they are mostly involved in the implementation of foreign aid policy and the disbursement of funds, in terms of the implementation stage of foreign decision making. Yeah, so they have increasingly become the channel through which foreign aid is dispersed. Part of the reason is because the states don't want to be, seen as intervening or, occupying a particular territory. So they are actually providing aid through NGOs. So 5% at the point in time, in 2007, this early 2000s rather. Lewis actually mentioned that 5% of all official aid was actually being channeled through NGOs. But of course, there have been criticisms, right, about NGOs, right, basically being the disbursement agency, because it is in other words actually serving as an agent of international aid donors. Yeah, so there may be actually a conflict of interest, right, between their purported mission and what they're supposed to be doing in the field as a disbursement agency for international aid donors. So this is, for those of you who actually do DV, right, this is actually very related to the developmental aid argument, in the humanitarian aid argument in DV. Yeah. So there's basically some authors, right, that have been actually studying foreign aid, right. They basically say that actually there's no evidence at all that foreign aid that is channeled through international and local NGOs is actually more effective in terms of performance, legitimacy, or accountability, even though, of course, NGOs are supposed to be accountable to the international aid donors, and supposed to report back, right? The what they've done with the aid, etc. Right, but it doesn't mean that because they are actually humanitarian, organizations, they are better, more capable with addressing the needs on the ground. And also they find that the performance of NGOs could also be compromised because they become more dependent on international foreign aid, and there may also be conditions attached to the use of aid, so they may be limited by the parameters put down by the donors. Okay, so this is actually sort of related but not really related, but it's actually talking about NGOs in Russia. So this is basically Russia, getting a bit antsy about foreign NGOs. They're opening up in Russia, right? Because they feel that they are foreign agents of the donor countries, right? Sponsoring, certain democratic, what do you call it, activism in Russia.
Campaign groups funded from abroad will face tougher scrutiny in Russia. Russia's parliament has given the green light to a bill forcing such organizations to register as foreign agents. RTC Gorpaskin, though, is following this story in the State Duma. Yegor, was there much debate today in parliament on this new law?
Well, today these were the final readings of the draft, so the deputies were pretty much discussing the amendments previously put forward, including those proposed by President Putin. They did end up passing the draft, so it's now up to the upper house, the Federation Council, to approve it, and then for the president to sign it. So the idea is that all non-profit organizations funded from abroad and involved in politics have to register themselves as foreign agents and report to the authorities on their activities. The goal is to prevent prevent outside forces from interfering with Russia's internal matters. Now, there was quite a lot of discussion and lots of criticism of this draft, with many critics saying that it could be potentially anti-democratic, but these amendments were introduced which specify that these groups funded from abroad have to be involved in politics, since there's a wide range of organizations, including media, educational institutions, and so on, which, couldn't be affected by this draft in the end, as the deputies decided finally. So the initiators say that this is really a question of protecting national interest and really a question of national security, and a similar practice is being used for a very, very long time in the West. And my colleague Ngos explains.
The West hurried to dub the proposed legislation as a Kremlin crackdown on NGOs.
It shows a money flow. Where's the money coming from for these organizations? So you get transparency, you get regulation, you get some monitoring of their activities. These are all things that a nation, a sovereign nation, is allowed to do.
U.S. officials were quick to express concern, presenting it as an exclusively Russian initiative. But as the Russian foreign minister said, the concept and even the wording of the proposed law was almost entirely borrowed from the American bill called the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
If you work in the United States, if you work for another country, you have to register as an agent of that country. Now, again, that's not a negative meaning, but it means that you are representing that country, and that has to be known if you're getting paid or under the employment of any foreign nation.
Veronika Krasheninnikova says while in the U.S., she was forced to register as a foreign agent, even though she was not involved in any political activities.
I was a representative from St. Petersburg. We promoted economic cooperation, tourism, cultural ties. Nevertheless, the U.S. Justice Department, which monitors the activities of foreign agents, insisted that representatives of cities also registered as foreign agents. Our version of the law doesn't even include non-political actors like that.
The Foreign Agents Registration Act in the U.S., quote, requires persons acting as agents of foreign principals in a political or quasi-political capacity to make periodic public disclosure of their relationship with the foreign principal, as well as activities, receipts, and disbursements in support of those activities, end of quote. The sponsors of the Russian bill say their version is almost identical with the American law. The U.S. argues the difference is that their law doesn't address nonprofit organizations. But many see another difference.
The U.S. doesn't have thousands of foreign organizations which work to change its constitution, to change its leadership. But we in Russia do have a situation when scores of organizations work precisely on that. For example, when some NGO calls for people to join a protest, they have the right to know who's behind that NGO, on whose payroll they are.
Members of some non-governmental organizations met with Hillary Clinton behind closed doors in St. Petersburg. Afterwards, one of them, Dmitry Dubrovsky, said the Secretary of State is aware of the proposed law and, quote, is searching for ways to modify the support of Russia's NGOs without subjecting them to a crackdown, end of quote.
When we say non-governmental organizations, many of these organizations are government funded, right? So they get some of their funding from the government of the United States anyway. So, and if she's saying that, then they certainly do, and they're certainly going to either get it overtly, and maybe she's hinting at covertly, I don't know.
Many of the NGOs in Russia which get their financing from abroad preach openness and transparency, and the sponsors of this Russian bill argue it only makes sense that they themselves are subject to the same principles of transparency. I'm Ngos in Washington, RT.
Okay, so this is another RT report on the not-so-non-profit charitable organizations in the U.S.
Greetings from Washington, D.C., home of the President, the Congress, and the 501c3. Call them think tanks, policy forums, institutes, or NGOs. They're the alphabet soup of tax-exempt organizations that influence opinion, push policy agendas, and lobby Washington.
This is something that some anthropologists and activists refer to as the nonprofit industrial complex.
And while millions of nonprofits provide vital services to people around the world, others are created for not-so-charitable purposes. After all, having your own NGO isn't so hard. A little paperwork, a $75 incorporation fee, and you're in business, even if, well, you don't really exist. The Arcadia Foundation bills itself as a nonprofit dedicated to promoting democracy and curbing corruption worldwide.
Human rights are being violated every day in Honduras.
But critics say it played a key role in the destabilizing efforts that led to the 2009 military coup in Honduras. But although it lists this Chevy Chase address on its tax and incorporation documents, the Arcadia Foundation doesn't have an office. Hi, yes, I'm looking for the offices of the Arcadia Foundation. Maybe a man named Robert Carmona Borjas?
He's no longer with us.
Nor does it have a working phone.
Thanks for calling Arcadia Foundation. Para castellano, por favor oprima el número 2. Our office is presently closed. The voicemail box is full.
At any of its 9 offices around the world.
Please try again later.
According to the D.C. Bureau of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, the Arcadia Foundation lists only one person on its board, Robert Carmona Borjas. And since its charter was revoked September 13th, 2010, legally speaking, the Arcadia Foundation no longer exists. But Arcadia is still alive and well on the web. Critics say that's all it ever was, a tangle of websites and the ambitions of one man.
He's managed to create an important, strong profile for his agenda, which is fundamentally an agenda of supporting the far right wing throughout Latin America in preventing democracy from taking hold.
Still, the Arcadia Foundation has its fans.
I'm Ryan Gosling, and I'd like to invite you to join me in supporting the Arcadia Foundation.
Even former Colombian President Álvaro Uribe.
Arcadia Foundation carries out. This is a very good job.
It's also important for the big telecommunications companies with serious money to make in Honduras that Carmona Borjas signed contracts for. The poorer the country, the more influence these Washington-based nonprofits have over its policies. Investigative reporter Jeb Sprague says that Haiti is a prime example. The nation of 10 million is home to an estimated 10,000 NGOs. That's one NGO per 1,000 people.
Haiti has sometimes been called the Republic of NGOs. It actually has the most NGOs of any country in the world.
Among them is the Haiti Democracy Project, a Washington-based think tank that observes elections and lobbies the State Department. The group receives sizable donations from members of the tiny Haitian elite. Deep ties between D.C. nonprofits and transnational elites mean sweetheart deals for big donors.
One of our founding board members, is an industrialist in Haiti. Has a pharmaceutical company and a brewery, and he contributes from time to time.
And what's his name? I'm sorry?
Rudolph Boulos.
Boulos was under investigation for the 2002 murder of Jean Dominique, a Haitian journalist who exposed how Boulos' pharmaceutical company poisoned 60 children.
In many ways, Haiti is the model of the future, not Afghanistan, not Iraq. In those countries where they've spent hundreds of billions of dollars, where thousands of lives of U.S. soldiers and NATO soldiers have been lost, by comparison, Haiti has been done on the cheap.
But what is all in a day's work for a seemingly insignificant NGO in D.C. can change the political future of a country thousands of miles away, and those who are forced to live its reality every day. Kaylin Ford, RT, Washington, D.C. Okay, so you see that NGOs actually play a direct role, right, in influencing domestic politics of the donor countries, because they do actually provide information, right, on critical and crucial information from the ground. So you could see it as they are being pragmatic in the way that they are able to achieve goals on the ground more easily if they can get government aid. They are also opportunistic because they are able to act as a channel for the aid. That would also give them further opportunities to work with the donor government as well. And there's the practical aspect of it, which is they can help the local government to improve the socioeconomic conditions of the local people. They could also basically play the role of a lobby group by cultivating direct relationship with government officials so that they can add pressure to the decisions of governments. So through lobbying, right, they can actually pressure the governments to provide more aid. And they may also attempt to influence any new legislation that is related to the field or the issue that they are advocating for.
Okay, so this is an interview with David Miliband, and he basically talks about the importance of NGOs.
One of the attractions for me about moving into the NGO sector is that it really can be at the cutting edge of innovation, because however much decent societies need good government and a dynamic private sector, it's often in the NGO sector that you find the most dynamism, the most innovation. And when you're talking about the sort of intractable problems that IRC is trying to confront, it sometimes takes an NGO to find different ways of doing things. So for me, the move out of politics is a move to make a difference. I think I can make more difference in this role, but it's also about finding ways to push the boundaries of what is possible. And I think it's in organisations like the IRC that we have the best chance to do it. I know and have seen how much difference aid has made over the last 15 years. Some of the advances in health and education have been extraordinary, and no one would have believed they've been achieved by the combination of public, private and NGO sectors. But equally, we know there are big new challenges to make sure that every penny, every cent of aid is well spent. And that's something where we've got to make sure we understand that, for example, for refugees, most refugees are not in refugee camps. They're in urban areas. That calls for a different model of aid. We now know much more about how women and girls are at the forefront of abuse when in conflict situations. So we've got to make sure that our aid is really tuned and suited to the needs of those women and girls. We know that aid works much better, whether it's humanitarian aid or long-term development aid, if it's delivered in partnership with local people and local institutions. We've got to make sure we're part of that too. So although we've learnt a lot in the IRC's history about how to do aid right, although we've made huge strides in the last decade or two about how to break the back of some of the biggest problems, we also know that we can't afford to rest on our laurels. We've got to make sure that we're using money, public money that comes from governments, but also money from private donors to absolutely best effect. And that's something that IRC's commitment to real serious evaluation, research, learning from our work makes sure happens.
Let's see. Okay, so Kim actually talks about the level of influence that NGO has, right? So basically, the level of direct NGO influence is actually affected by the number of NGOs that are actually in the issue space, yeah? And also the length of time that the NGO has actually operated in the particular country. So the longer time, right, the longer the length of time the NGO has operated in the particular country, the greater is its influence on the government in terms of on the donor country government in terms of foreign aid, right, promises. And then also, if let's say NGOs are actually cooperating with each other, right, you'll find that by being in a network, right, especially a transnational network of NGOs, right, it helps them to actually achieve their mission and goals more effectively because they are able to leverage, right, each other's networks as well. And so the larger the number of NGOs cooperating in a network, the easier it is for them to actually influence the foreign aid policies of their home governments as a lobbying group. So that's why you see that there's greater benefits from cooperating with other NGOs that work in the same policy space or issue space. Okay, so this is basically Kim's suggested model of state NGO relations. So basically, the stage one is really looking at whether this NGO has field operations, right? They are actually operating in the field on the ground, and how many of them are there, and what's the duration, right? The length of time that they have spent in the field. And then at stage two, it's where you're looking at how NGOs can actually try to raise awareness at home with their home governments, right? They can be information providers, they can be lobbying groups. And then at stage 3, that's where they are able to basically persuade, right, the government, right, to actually put in some more aid that they are demanding for, that they are asking for, right? And they may, approach the governments with specific projects that they are looking for funding for. And so that's where foreign aid is then dispersed through the NGOs. Okay, so Kim actually looks at the impact of NGOs, right, on foreign aid policy. And in the research, right, what Kim did was he actually constructed his own time series database data set based on looking at the US-based NGOs that were operating in 155 countries. So he actually, basically looked at the time period between 1960 to 2008, and he basically put together the time series data set on his own, looking at the yearly figures, yearly data that's provided by the US-based NGOs. So he wanted to find out what's the extent to which NGOs actually influence the foreign aid policy behaviors of the state. So when he ran the numbers, he found that the higher the number of US-based NGO field operations in a particular developing country, the higher would be the amount of foreign aid that the country will receive from the US government. So he estimated, right, from his crunching on the numbers, that for each additional US-based NGO that's operating in a country, the amount of annual foreign aid might increase by as much as $15 million or maybe more. He also found that the older, more established NGOs are effective in securing higher amounts of US foreign aid for the countries where they operate in than newly established NGOs. So for each additional NGO year of field operations, that means each year that NGO is actually on the field, in the ground, on the field, doing field operations, right? The developing country, right, that it is operating in, can expect to receive an additional 346,000 US dollars in foreign aid, from the US. He also found that basically NGOs actually have an influence on foreign aid decision of the states and not the other way around, meaning that it's not because of foreign aid, right, that NGOs are basically going into the field to set up their operations there. Yeah, so it's the causal direction is from NGOs to the states, not the other way around. Okay. Okay, so now let's take a look at how international media can affect foreign policy. So this is Paxson and the authors, right, and his co-authors. The aim of the study was actually to look at the news media's effect on the use of economic sanctions. And so basically looking at the time period between 1976 to 2000, and they basically did an analysis of all the media articles in Newsweek and the New York Times during this time period. Okay, so basically they found that the media actually has more influence, right, over the government's use of non-violent, less severe foreign policies. So things like foreign aid and economic sanctions. So when it comes to violent military types of foreign policy, right, media has less effect. But when it comes to foreign aid, economic sanctions, the more low politics kind of policy area, right, the media has more influence over the government's use of foreign aid and economic sanctions. So they also found that when there's intense media coverage, right, it's likely to result in the use of economic sanctions against abusive states. So those states that are basically found to have human rights, been involved in human rights violations. And so U.S. policymakers basically use sanctions in response to public pressure, even though it is, they know that, the economic sanctions do not always work, right? There's low success rate. We talked about this, I think, in week 6 or week 7, right? We found that economic sanctions only had about 30% success rate. So US policymakers also tend to balance the public's demand for action against its security imperative to maintain good ties with allies. So basically you find that the public may be demanding for action, right, against this human rights, against this state that is known to be, to have human rights abuses and violations. But if the U.S. actually, the policymakers actually feel that, these they need to maintain good ties still with this, state that has been violating human rights, right? They will basically not sanction the ally as much. So they found that the U.S. is more likely to sanction non-U.S. allies than U.S. allies, even though the media tends to provide more coverage of human rights abuses of U.S. allies as compared to U.S. non-allies. And then, so basically, the media's effect is conditioned by the strategic ties to the potential target state, right? It loses its effect, its influence. If, let's say, the target state is a ally that is required for strategic security purposes. Okay, so this next video is actually looking at Saudi Arabia. As you know, Saudi Arabia, right? MBS, the Crown Prince, was basically, the intelligence report actually said that he had ordered the killing of Khashoggi, right? Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist, and during the campaign trail, Biden actually said that MBS will have to answer for it. But after he took office and the intelligence report came out, right, we find that actually Biden didn't follow up with his what he said during this campaign. Yeah, so the question is why, right? Why is it despite all the media coverage, right, and the damning report from the intelligence agency that Biden and the policymakers are not actually holding Saudi Arabia to account. Yeah, I mean, or at least not imposing more extensive sanctions on Saudi Arabia. Okay, so this video actually explains why.
I would make it very clear. We were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are.
That was Joe Biden on the campaign trail. Back then, he was keen to talk tough on Saudi Arabia, its brutal war in Yemen, and the involvement of its Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in the murder of US-based journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
They have to be held accountable.
Now that Biden's in charge in the White House, his administration has taken a different tone.
We're going to recalibrate our relationship. They have critical self-defense needs, and we will continue to work with them on those.
And even after the world saw a U.S. intelligence report linking de facto leader Mohammed bin Salman to the 2018 murder, Biden took no direct action against the Crown Prince.
Biden flinched.
Sarah Leah Whitson is director of a rights organization founded by the late Jamal Khashoggi. They're disappointed that Biden hasn't introduced sanctions against MBS himself.
I think he was advised that taking an action such as that against Mohammed bin Salman would be too risky.
In this video, we're going to walk you through why taking harsher measures against the Saudis is much more difficult than making a campaign promise, and why some believe it would be worth taking the risk.
I look forward to building on what we've accomplished.
To assist the Saudi Arabian government in the defense of its
deeply
homeland.
Appreciate the cooperation of the Saudi government.
The Crown Prince is interested in peace in the region.
If they don't buy it from us, they're going to buy it from Russia or they're going to buy it from China.
Saudi Arabia and the United States appear to have little in common. One is a democracy, the other an autocratic monarchy. One has individual rights enshrined in its constitution, the other just recently allowed women to drive. One is majority Christian, the other Muslim. Yet despite these fundamental differences, the countries are deeply connected.
They're just practical interests that bring the US and Saudi Arabia together.
Sanam Vakil is a senior research fellow at Chatham House in the Middle East and North Africa program. Her work focuses on regional security and Gulf geopolitics.
The United States and Saudi Arabia are partners. Their partnership is transactional, based on shared threat perceptions and security dynamics and drivers in the Middle East. And they also have had shared interests to protect energy supplies, maritime, and shipping through the Persian Gulf as terror issues have become more of a global threat as well as a threat in the region of the Middle East. Both countries have coordinated to counter terrorism threats.
There's one country that looms large in all these American and Saudi security concerns: Iran.
The two share concerns and a view that Iran is a destabilizing regional actor.
These concerns were sparked in 1979. An Islamic revolution overthrew the US-friendly monarch. The new Iran was supremely confident in challenging the US, which it calls the Great Satan. Adding insult to injury was the US embassy hostage crisis in Tehran, a humiliating blow to the superpower's image on the world stage. Since then, Iran has developed a nuclear program, a huge source of pride for the regime in Tehran, and as big a problem for its opponents. Iran's Islamic revolution was also a turning point in its relations with the Saudis. The new Iran had regional ambitions that challenged Saudi Arabia. Some call their rivalry a Cold War. Much like the Cold War, each country has its own regional sphere of influence. Saudi Arabia's powerful friends include Egypt and the UAE. Even relations with Israel are showing signs of warming up after the UAE and other Saudi allies normalized relations with it. Iran maintains a sphere of influence by supporting militant groups in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, and Yemen. And like the Cold War, Iran and Saudi Arabia don't fight each other directly. Instead, they clash via allies and proxies in other states, with sometimes horrendous consequences for the region.
Yemen is one such battleground. There, Iran-backed Houthi rebels have been fighting Saudi-backed pro-government forces since Mohammed bin Salman intervened in 2015. His military uses American weapons and logistics to devastating effect. The fighting has created what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. So how does this rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia serve to tighten relations between Saudi Arabia and the US? It adds an element of the enemy of my enemy is my friend to the mix.
There's been a synchronicity in America's and Saudi Arabia's laser-focused enmity towards Iran.
Adding depth to their common desire to rein in Iranian influence, Saudi Arabia and the United States have a significant history. It was thanks to US companies in the 1940s and American consumers since then that Saudi Arabia was the world's largest oil exporter for more than half a century. The oil trade made the previously poor kingdom extremely wealthy, and it quickly became America's biggest weapons customer. military cooperation between the two countries peaked during the First Gulf War. In 1991, a US-led coalition expelled Iraqi forces that had invaded Kuwait. More than 500,000 US troops flooded into the region, with many based in Saudi Arabia. Washington still maintains military bases in the kingdom. Saudi Arabia is right next to Iran and useful in exerting pressure on the regime there. All of these things add up to make Saudi Arabia a very powerful, very valuable regional ally to the United States. But they also make punishing MBS over the murder of a journalist a very costly prospect.
The challenge for Biden is that taking on Saudi Arabia is not a bilateral operation. It would mean taking on the Quad of Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, who now act in a great deal in concert for their joint interests.
It's important to think quite pragmatically about the Saudi-US relationship. The US has interests that have to be protected and defended. To go so far as to sanction a prospective future leader in a country where they have close partnerships and strategic interests would be counterproductive for the United States, particularly while Saudi Arabia is sort of on this precipice of nurturing change in the country. It is also in the interest of the United States to be involved in that process, to support and nurture that process, to alienate a future leader who could be in power for generations, I don't think would be productive to that relationship. The U.S., under the Biden administration, has taken a position where they are not going to enable Saudi Arabia for bad behavior.
So what is that position that the Biden administration has taken? What it did was announce an end to U.S. support to the Saudi-led military campaign in Yemen, and that it would no longer supply the oil-rich kingdom with offensive weapons.
It's a bit of a semantic twist to label certain weapons as offensive and defensive. We have to keep in mind that Saudi Arabia's justification for going to war, and every bit of the weapons it's claimed were for the purposes of a preemptive defense to preempt Iran from gaining influence in Yemen.
The US State Department has also announced what it calls the Khashoggi Ban, a visa restriction policy against individuals considered to be participating in state-sponsored efforts to harass, detain, or harm dissidents and journalists around the world. 76 Saudis are already subject to that visa ban.
We feel that we can have the most influence over this partnership when it is cast as a recalibration and not a rupture.
Many critics want the Biden administration to ban all arms sales to Saudi Arabia and to punish MBS directly. Sarah Leah Whitson from the organization founded by the late Jamal Khashoggi says such steps would not wreck US-Saudi relations, and she suggests it might even do some good inside Saudi Arabia.
Mohammed bin Salman has upended what used to be a consensual method of decision-making, not one maybe that meets our standards, of democracy or representation, but one that.
Okay, I hope that was an interesting video for you guys. I thought it was quite apt and related to what we were discussing, or at least what this Paxson was discussing in the article. Okay, let's take a look at foreign policy and international norms. So this next article that I summarized here is actually by Brazis and Panke, and basically looking at the resolutions, the votes, right? UN resolution votes. And so basically you find that UNGA actually votes on 300 resolutions annually, and some of these resolutions do come up for repeated votes. There are some repetitions. So states may sometimes shift their vote on the same resolution, and that would be, according to the authors, an indication of a shift in their foreign policy. But the authors also said that it's actually puzzling why they would shift, right? Because there's actually quite a bit of administrative, political, and financial costs involved once they actually shift, and change their position altogether. But they noted that vote shifts are actually more likely where low politics policies are concerned. So those those policies that are related to low politics issues. And they say that it's often these vote shifts are often actually traced to changes in the domestic political scene that would have resulted in having to also change the foreign policy. So that is one of the explanation for why vote shifts might happen for low politics policies. And in terms of high politics policy areas, right, we find that these actually are viewed by the states as having higher stakes, and so they have huge incentives to actually avoid shifting their votes on those issues, because they don't want to be singled out or isolated by the international community. So the author said that it's important to examine when and how states change their positions on established and developing norms, as it would also tell us how international norms both develop and persist over time. Okay, so the puzzle that they wanted to solve was, why do states actually change their foreign policy when international norms remain unchanged? So they looked at a sample size of 311 unique items put to the vote at the UNGA, and they found that 157 of these resolutions were repeated at least twice over the 10-year period from 1999 to 2000 to 2009 2010. So the voting categories, as you know, in the UNGA is yes in favor, no against, and abstain, to indicate that they're indifferent to the resolution. So the findings, right, that the authors basically listed was that we found that vote shifts were actually common, right, because there were almost 15,000 actually recorded over the 10-year period. And but then they found that in high politics areas such as disarmament and geopolitics, you actually have less shifts recorded. In low politics areas, right, like human rights or development, you find that there are dynamic vote shifts more common. And so they said that there are both domestic push and international pull factors that can trigger a vote shift. But the dynamics are actually quite different. And so for highly politicized resolutions, like the high politics issues like nuclear proliferation and security, the changes to foreign policy actually occur when states are trying to avoid international isolation. They don't want to be singled out. They don't want to be labeled as pariah states. For low politics resolutions, so in terms of low politics resolutions, they actually identified human rights norms and the respective resolutions as part of low politics resolutions. They found that changes often occur when the domestic government of the state has changed, right? Then that particular state will actually change its vote, right? The next time the resolution is put to the vote. Maybe the state may have faced intense lobbying by third-party states and international groups, so that actually puts pressure on them, right, from above to actually change their vote. And then they may also find that the context, right, of the environment, right, normative environment surrounding the human rights abuse has changed, so that would also cause them to basically re-examine, right, the factors, and then to rethink their vote. And so you might see a change in policy, a change in the resolution, the vote on the resolution. Okay, so they had 4 hypotheses, right, that they provided, that the authors provided. So they basically, built or provided a framework, a push-pull model of foreign policy change. So they said that, um, the push could be due to a domestic agency, due to something that's happening within the domestic arena. So, for example, a domestic government change right after national elections. So, new government in power, they may have a new set of norm-related preferences. So, they may actually the new government, when it goes to the UN, it may change the vote, right? There'll be a vote shift. There may be a push factor in terms of structure. So in terms of goodness of fit between domestic and international norms. So if the international norm is actually aligned to the domestic norm, there will be a higher likelihood that the state would vote in favor of the UN resolution. But if the language in the text of repeated resolutions are changed, it's more likely that this change may actually, the change could be a positive change in terms of matching the domestic norm structure, or it could be a negative change in terms of mismatch to the domestic norm structure, and that would cause a vote shift. Then on the there's a pull factor on the international level, right? In terms of agency, there could be lobbying efforts by third-party states or groups, right? So the more intense the lobbying effort, the more likely the state would adjust its foreign policy and change its vote on the resolution, especially if they deem the item to be of low priority, so low politics issue, or if the state wishes to avoid being singled out by the international community. Then there's also the pull structure factor, which is a change in the international context. So states are more likely to revisit their policy position and modify their vote if the context of the resolution has changed considerably. So if the context has changed, right, by quite a bit, it would invalidate that initial vote, right, on the old resolution. Okay. So in terms of low politics issues, right, low politics resolutions, Brazis and Tanke actually found that within the 10-year period under study, there were actually 24 resolutions, right, to do with low politics issues. So basically, what they were looking at was country-specific human rights resolutions. So there were 24 of those, and 9 of those resolutions were repeated. Right, basically there were repeat votes, being called for during that 10-year period. So the 9 resolutions were repeated, and when they were repeated, it accumulated 524 vote shifts, which is 58%. 58% vote shifts per resolution on average. So the vote shifts were actually traced mainly to basically domestic government change, to intense lobbying efforts by third-party states, and to changes in the international context since the first resolution was voted on. So, like we said before, domestic government change, right? The new government may have a different set of concerns and norms, right? So that would necessarily change the votes that it would make, right, at when the next time the resolution is called. And then when you find that also international pressure is actually a significant inducer of vote change. And when you have country-specific resolutions, right, you'll find that when there are actually changes on what's happening on the ground, right, the context has changed on the ground in the say the human rights norm violating state, right, and then it may have improved, for example, that would change the state's vote, right, when the resolution is called. So at the time of the vote, right, the specific facts on the ground would matter. So for high politics resolution, which would be the disarmament, this would be disarmament resolutions that they were looking at. Yeah, so within the 10-year period that they were studying, there were actually 101 unique resolutions on disarmament. 62 resolutions were repeated, and when they were repeated, it accumulated to 2,621 vote shifts, which is equivalent to 40% of the vote shifts per resolution. But you'll find that compared to low politics resolutions, right, 40% versus 58%, you see that actually there's greater vote shifts in low politics resolution than high politics resolutions. When the 62 resolutions were repeated, 65 states did not shift their position, so they actually stood firm to their original vote, right? But there were 22 states that accounted for over half of the net movement on resolutions to do with arms control. So they found that vote shifts were traced mainly to the fact that there was a alignment between domestic and international norms. So if, let's say, the repeated resolution, right, the text of a resolution has been modified quite a bit, and the states that wanted those modifications to the text of the resolutions were actually successful in pushing for the modification that they wanted, they are more likely to change their vote in support of the resolution, because now it matches, there's an alignment between what's in the resolution and what their domestic norms are. And then in terms of lobbying efforts as well, right? When there's actually intense lobbying efforts by third-party states, there's strong empirical evidence that that this causes vote shifts. So the whole point of this lobbying effort is to maximize, right, the sponsorship of resolutions among states, and also to maximize the support for the preferred voting outcome of the lobbying group. Okay, so this is basically what Brazis and Panke found in terms of resolutions, in terms of UNGA votes on resolutions. Okay. All right, so I guess this marks the end of Block 9. So these are the learning outcomes for Block 9. And so you're supposed to evaluate the significance of transnational actors, right, in shaping of states' foreign policy. You need to describe the process by which IGOs and non-state actors influence a state's foreign policy, and also assess whether complex interdependency provides a useful model for understanding the engagement of transnational actors and the state in foreign policy. Okay, so I hope that whatever we've covered today and last week, right, you would actually feel that you're able to do all these things, that you have achieved these outcomes. And these are some exam questions for Block 9. If you take a quick look through, do you think that these are questions that you probably would be able to answer, given what we've covered last week and today? Or are there some questions that you think will be challenging? How would you answer? I mean, what? How would you answer the first question, for example? Okay, I guess I think I've lost you guys. Oh, Sherry's still around. Pressuring our states. I mean, IGOs, I think those of you who are doing IO, you should be able to answer this question, right? Explain the role of non-state. Yeah, but and this is actually, I mean, when you talk about IGOs, it's actually intergovernmental organizations, so it would be things like UN, right? So you'll need to think about what's, uh, yeah, naming, shaming, socializing states into complying with the norms, right? Um, you would also note that for IGOs, right, resolutions that are adopted at the IGOs, supposedly non-binding, but you still have to ratify, right, within the political arena, yeah, with in your domestic um, um, parliaments or whatever. And so that would also have an impact on your foreign policy as well, right? Can serve as a conduit for norm cascading. Yeah, your IGOs do that. So, I mean, in terms of IGOs, you could actually look at them as in terms of norm definition, emergence. Yeah. Yep, norm cascading. Yeah, they do have a huge sphere of influence. Um, Except that, remember, we also had that, was it Early and Spies, right? That talked about how size matters, right? If it's a large versus a small IGO, right? A smaller IGO would be better able to make the members comply with the norms compared to the larger IGOs. Because there's greater scrutiny of what the member states are doing. Yeah, so in this case, you could actually look at, I mean, the Early and Spice article from last week, which was looking at economic sanctions, right? Um, why is it, despite IGOs implementing economic sanctions, there are spoilers, right? There are states that are deemed as spoilers because they actually help the sanctioned state get around the economic sanctions. Okay, yeah, for regionalism. Yeah. So regionalism, smaller. I mean, the IGOs tend to be smaller, right? They tend to be also more closely bound, right, in terms of interest. Maybe that's why. I mean, if you look at NATO, that's part of the reason why you see that there's such a differing um, response, right, towards Russia. Yeah. Because they don't all have a common. I mean, they have a common enemy, Russia, but they don't really have common approach, right? In terms of how they are how they are thinking they should approach the problem with Ukraine, of Russia and Ukraine. Okay, yeah. So these, I don't know. I mean, do you think that these would be questions that you all would be able to answer? Two would be a little bit tougher. It's the diplomacy of transnational actors aimed at changing states' foreign policy ideas or their actions. Yeah, that would be a tough one, actually. Um, not that straightforward. Yeah. I mean, how influential it is mixed, right? In terms of probably low politics issues. That's why you see that a lot of humanitarian organizations, right? The transnational advocacy networks and all that. It's more to do with humanitarian issues and all that. Um, that would be the place where transnational actors would probably have more impact, more influence on state foreign policy. Okay, so 2019 and 2016 is quite similar, in terms of the content that you need to, in order to respond to those two questions. Yeah. So remember that transnational actors, it's not just IGOs, right? It is IGOs, media as well, transnational media. Yeah. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. These are the references that I used.